So is it below zero up in Bemidji?
It is actually above zero. It's 12 Fahrenheit right now.
Oh, it's a
Having kind of
hot
a
day, hot day.
mild morning. Yeah. It was chilly this morning. Okay, so let me I literally just walked back from across campus. I was on the other side of campus with my historical methods students. We're having a little seminar kind of format. And actually, I was talking to them about note taking to kind of begin the semester. So I was showing them actually showing them my Obsidian Vault and my notes that I wrote on these two chapters. And I actually while I was writing notes on these chapters, I went into our library system and I requested a couple of books that Graeber and Wengrow cited, which was a lot of fun because it's kind of cool to be able. And a couple of them, one of them was available as a PDF, so I was able to just jam that into Zotero and start reading it. Start reading the PDF immediately. The other ones are on the way, and I connected Zotero to Research Rabbit. So, I showed them that whole kind of workflow. I got the books coming, I got the reference in Zotero, I got the explosion of other suggestions out of Research Rabbit, and and that's and the other, I'm co-teaching this with another historian here who has been, I think, probably doing more of his research the old-fashioned way, kind of with paper and pens and things. And so he was like, well, could you like write us up a flow chart of the workflow that shows what you use each of these apps for and how you do it. And I'm thinking, I was thinking, yeah, I could do that. That sounds a whole lot like a YouTube video. so that'll probably be happening over the weekend. But how's everybody doing? What I heard, I kind of felt some pain with chapter 10 with people's reaction to it.
I think Kindle told me it was like a 3 or 4 hours long read.
Yeah, I actually decided to sort of back away from the whole caring violence section because I'm not really sure how I feel about that yet. But we can start with 9 because now finally the whole Teotihuacan section that I thought was in the previous chapter, here we are with it. So what about the idea that Highland Teotihuacan and Lowland Maya cultures are an example of schismogenesis? That seemed to be the big, one of the big takeaways from that section.
Well, I'll jump in the fray, but I mean, if someone wants to answer Dan directly, I will defer to them. But my view on today's reading was I've read chapters 1 through 9, and basically I got the same message 9 times. Chapters 1 through 9 were saying ad nauseum, Rousseau is wrong, Marx is wrong. And that's all it was. It was just all these counter arguments to generalizations which you could make from either Rousseau or Marx. And the claim of Rousseau or the claim of Marx, depending on, or Jared Diamond or whoever. But the whole point that was repeated ad nauseum for chapters 1 through 9, in my view, of course, was that these people were saying social structure was the effect of material relations of property. And example after example after example after example, modes of production, looking at economic base, looking at technology, looking at production, fails. It fails. It fails. There was 9 chapters of saying it's always a failure to look at material geography, material ecology, material technology. Economic base does not explain social superstructure. So it was a negative thing. It's, everyone's wrong, and we'll show you why they're wrong. So
did that change for you at all?
Well, no, it's like, oh my God. So finally, chapter 10, we finally have the big reveal. Is the whole book going to be, why is the whole world wrong except us? So finally, in chapter 10, we have the big answer to the big question. Remember, was it chapter 1 or chapter 2, where they say we have a new social science? We have a new social theory. We have a new science of history.
Mm-hmm. So,
but all I saw from chapters 1 through 9 was we don't have anything. We just know everybody else is wrong.
So
I'm gonna step in.
Chapter 10
jump
was
in,
the
Nate.
big reveal. Here's the big reveal in chapter 10.
I think if there's a message from chapters 1 through 9, I think it's that we have a multitude of options that have existed previously that we've just erased from our consciousness.
Yeah, but 10, they deliver, or they attempt to deliver on their promise. Here is the new social theory.
Okay.
And guess what?
Which
it's just
which
like
is
the
what?
old social theory.
Okay,
Except instead of being Rousseau and Marx's social theory, it's Nietzsche and Weber's social theory. That's all it is. There is no new social theory. What they say is that history, contrary to Marx, contrary to Rousseau, cannot be taxonomized. There is no typology based on production. There is a typology. You can classify stages or periods in history by different forms of domination, which is straight out of Nietzsche. And then Weber takes Nietzsche, and these guys are taking Weber. Wengrow and Graeber are taking Weber. And what do they say? They say we can periodize history. It is useful. There's explanatory power in categorizing different stages of history in terms of different forms of domination. So social power is the superstructure. It's just Marx, right? There's a base and there's a superstructure. For Marx, what was the base? It was the economy. For Marx, what was the base ultimately? It was control over the means of production. For these guys, Wengrow and Graeber, there's a base. What is the base? Instead of means of production, it's means of coercion. And then subsidiarily, it's charisma and control of the bureaucracy. But they say a number of times, at the end of the day, when we're occupying Wall Street in Zuccotti Park, what is the ultimate determinant? It's means of violence. And
okay, so
that's what's going to do it. So means of coercion is the historical materialist base. And it's Nietzschean, the workshop where ideals are made is where you torture, where you rip people's hearts out, where you draw and quarter them, where you boil them in oil. So that is their science. It's Weber and it's Nietzsche.
Let's unpack these 3 things. I don't think that it is. I think that there's still an opposition between places where power and hierarchy pertain and other places where it doesn't. Right? This kind of duality between the Teotihuacan highlanders and the Mayan lowlanders. In chapter 10, I do find the 3 freedoms: freedom to move, freedom to disobey, and freedom to reorganize, are opposed by these three principles of power: sovereignty, which is control of coercive violence; administration, which is control of information and technologies; and individual charisma, which seems a little bit less well defined to me. But I'm not sure that I agree that they're saying that this is the whole of our social science and this explains everything. Anybody else want to weigh in?
I kind of wonder too, given what you've just said, Dan, the world eventually becomes so heavily populated that it's much harder, in the last, election cycle, I had more than a few friends say, hey, if Mr. Cheeto wins the US presidential election, I'm moving to Canada. And that's an option, or you could, move to some other country where you would feel comfortable. But the problem eventually becomes, what all those other places look like, and there's no other place to move and take, you can't take your ball and go to build a new playground, because there's no land left in which to build your playground and have that kind of freedom. So what happens when things become so populous, you can't move from one space to the next and find that? But I also find too, and there's kind of growing evidence that I'm seeing and reading too, that even within North America, and certainly within the moiety system of indigenous peoples in Australia, it's very, very much the same, even in modern day social structures. You can go across the country and you'll find a group of people who are of your moiety, who owe you family connections and support and help. So some of these social ties go across, thousands and thousands of miles, but it's such a dramatic shift from the society and culture that we live in the West. So I'll take Mike's idea. They're really hammering into us through the whole book. And Mike, you've got at least 2.5, 3 more chapters of that same message being pounded. But we've lived in this milieu for so long, we don't know what it looks like outside of that. So, what do we do? And so they're kind of pounding this idea in, but at the same time too, they've presented some evidence and given us some stories, but I don't think we have a full enough picture of what these prior societies actually looked like and how they worked. We've got a few ideas. They're throwing a few ideas about how they did to us and trying to reframe it. But I think and they indicated there were several more books to follow this, and I'm hoping those show up. But what are those other modes of living look like? How much better are they or worse? And honestly, I think there's even space in, they're pounding on Rousseau and Hobbes, but I think a lot of, in Western thought, it goes back further to even Aristotle. The idea of the scala naturae. There's a big hierarchy of everything and everybody fits on it somewhere. So that our hierarchy stuff is started 2,000 years earlier than they're even starting with. And how do we erase that?
Yeah. Well, yeah. And I think, Chris, to the point you're making about these moieties that exist over continental or even greater, distances, I think that maybe, a place that I might be comfortable with having them or somebody who carries on this work go with that is into sort of imagined communities, right? Because I think, when I think of, I tried to move to British Columbia under W, and then I tried to move to Chile, right? And none of it worked out. But so here I am in Minnesota. But I did move to northern Minnesota, where I can probably count on one hand the number of places where I believe my image is being captured by cameras, which exist on every street corner, on every block in every major city in America, even the Twin Cities, right? But up here, not quite as much. So there are some differences, and and maybe some ways to escape surveillance and stuff. But what I was thinking of as you were talking was sort of other types of community, right? Whether it's extended family, whether when I go with my son and my father to Europe in the summer, we'll see any extended family. I don't think we're going to Italy, but or what other types of people might we see, if we only go to Germany and Austria, right? Will we see, will we go to Berlin and will we find some, will we go to Ableton and find some Ableton people, right? Will there be other types of people that we can connect with and obviously that's not for shelter and hey, I can throw myself on you and live on you and surf on your couch kind of thing, but are there ways that we can sort of create community? And I think that is probably, that reminds me a lot of what I know of kind of Graeber's history as an activist internationally, that probably, he had some experience with that type of building a kind of a consensus or a global community of like-minded people. I also think of sort of the partisans, right? These international, kind of resistors in the early years, the early, generations and centuries of European nation building, right? So I don't know. I do think that it's interesting. I mean, and Mike, I kind of appreciate the way that they're sort of complicating this picture as they're going along. And adding, and just adding a lot of detail. I mean, I teach this, sort of pre-Columbian Mesoamerica thing. I'm going through parts of it this week at the beginnings of my environmental history and my world history classes, and it was interesting to kind of drill down into that idea that, well, wait a minute, yeah, Teotihuacan was. It was uninhabited for 5 or 6 centuries between its heyday and then the arrival of the Mexico from up north, wherever they came from, and just sort of images. I'm finding some value in just images like that, like this lost world kind of thing, this harking back to this previous culture that has left these monuments, right? And the idea of people 1,000 years ago having that experience and doing that and sort of organizing their their own origin stories around these kind of hazy ideas of what had happened in the past. So I'm finding some value in all of that kind of stuff.
I was curious, Mike, if I'm reading it right, that what I'm hearing is kind of frustration. Maybe I can just say, what is the source of your frustration? Is it the ad nauseum part, or is it the sense that they are suggesting they're making claims that, in your experience, are not new claims, but they're claiming them as new? Yeah, what's the source of your frustration about this?
Sure. Can I address that, Dan, or would you like?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I agree, Dan, that it's a great read. It's very entertaining. I love the stories. To address your question, Simon, but I mean, these guys really built it up, right? They didn't just say, oh, we have this little collection of anecdotes for your historical pleasure here. We want you to be as excited by archaeology and anthropology as we are. That is not what they said at the beginning. They said, we have a new science of society, okay, so I don't expect a series of entertaining snapshots. I expect data to support a new theory, a new theoretical structure. Now, I forget which chapter it was, but maybe 3 or 4. I was going, oh my God, did you really say this? They both say, well, it's one book, but they write in one of the earlier chapters, they say, most people look at things in terms of domination. We're going to look at it in terms of freedom. There's really no way to determine how you want to look at it. It's just a matter of taste. And if you want, I can look for that. But I mean, they say straight out, how you look at history is a matter of taste. And I thought, wait a minute, you're writing this whole book just on the basis, the foundation of it's a matter of taste? Why are you with so much vehemence tearing apart every other social theorist? If their response could just be, well, we like vanilla ice cream, you like chocolate ice cream. It's just a matter of taste. So there was a little bit of theoretical incoherence. When I saw that, I thought, what kind of science of history is this? But anyway, to answer you straight on, Simon, yes, I feel let down because I read 9 chapters of why everybody else was wrong. And I feel as if chapter 10, finally, they reveal their new theory. And I'm real excited because I want to see a real coherent anarchistic theory of history, which is what I thought I was going to get from them. And instead, I'm reading Maggie's quote.
I just found the quote.
Oh, okay, thanks.
On page 206.
Oh, thanks, Maggie.
Yeah. Instead, what do I get? This is Weber. And they actually make a bunch of references to Weber in chapter 10. Now, Weber is a really important figure in social science. But what they've done, as far as I can tell, is say, we are going to take the social theory of Weber and apply it to more recent discoveries in archaeology. Nothing wrong with that, Simon. I'm just like, is that it? Is that it? That's your new science of history? Max Weber? Weber is 100 years old at this point. And what does Weber say? He says, I'm going to take a Nietzschean view of the world. What did Nietzsche say? And what did Weber say? They say Marx got it wrong. Rousseau got it wrong. You cannot create a typology of society on the basis of creative production. Rousseau and Marx said a useful way to examine the world of human social interaction is how do they produce their material lives? And Nietzsche and Weber say, no, that's wrong. What drives history is power. What drives history is domination. And if we are going to understand social structure, what did Weber do? Weber, they say straight out, well, Ehring, I never even heard of this guy, Ihering, Ehring, however you pronounce his name. But, Weber says it's monopoly over the means of violence. It's Weber who studies bureaucracy. It's Weber who, no one ever used the word charisma before Weber. It was a very obscure word. Weber is the person who took this out of a religious context and applied it to social science. So what have they done? They have said, I'm talking about Wengrow and Graeber, what they're saying is, instead of looking at the means of production, we are going to look at the means of coercion. And that is how we're going to create a taxonomy of societies. That's how we're going to understand history. So I feel let down because I'm like, that's it. I wanted something really new and different. And personally, if it's all a matter of taste, I'd much rather look at the world in terms of creative production instead of violence. One human being exercising violent, coercive force over another human being. If it's just a matter of taste, and if it's just aesthetics.
Wait, can I address this matter of taste thing? Because I think Maggie did find, unless there's another place where they mention this.
If it's the word taste, this is the only one I found that.
Yeah, then what they're saying here is setting the dial between, what they're doing is they're saying that there is a spectrum of freedom and coercion, right? And where you know, and that there is no inevitability about what degree of freedom and what degree of coercion we're going to have, and where you want to say the best society lies is the matter of taste. Not that you can just say anything about history and that any type of historical interpretation is admissible and is equally good, based on taste. But that instead of, and I do think that they are, I think I agree with you, Mike, that they are attacking the determinism, the productive determinism, and talking about this relationship between freedom and coercion. But the way that I have perceived this, this constant complication and layering of, and especially, as they're showing these adjacent, and opposed communities, where one of them is very hierarchical and has these, elements of unfreedom, and the other one has resisted that and has maybe specifically, and maybe because of the example of the other, gone the other way. I think that is all. I think that supports their idea that what they are doing is maybe not in this one volume answering the question of what should a new science of anthropology and sociology look like, but what's wrong with the previous one. So I think that probably, they overpromised and probably promised on the basis of the expectation that they were going to write a volume 2 and a volume 3. And that this, and this was going to be part of a project that Graeber was going to survive to do. But I guess I'm not having as much of a problem with that claim, and I'm not having as much of a problem with the types of complications that they do. This whole in chapter 9, this whole description of Tlaxcala as an indigenous republic is interesting to me because I thought, and actually dealing with man, who I like, and I actually use 1491 when I teach, as sort of having been dependent on these, secondary sources that he read, and that fascinates me a lot, right? The whole idea of doing history in trade press, for the general public. So I thought that was an interesting moment. These other sources that I hadn't really been, I think they're covering a lot of ground. And I think that when they bring in sources like this guy Motolinia, talking about the Chichimec and about the origin stories of the, and beliefs about their origins that the Aztecs had, I think that is all really, really valuable. And and as a historian, from the perspective of there having been kind of a master narrative that has been for a long time, I think, kind of ignored because because in prehistory there wasn't much that we could know, and now there are new things that we're discovering using new technologies. But then even in these things, there was this writing, I did it. That was one of the books that I requested, right? The Motolinia book, which I haven't read yet. And so I appreciate them calling that to my attention.
Yeah, I think one of the things that would have been nice would be to know what are the outline theses of books 2, 3, and so on. Because if you look at it, even from a pedagogical standpoint, they start out in this book that's obviously written for the broad trade press and not, there is a historian group of people who are going to read this and think and comment on it, but they're writing it for a broader public.
Mhm.
And most of the early people that they're quoting in the first couple chapters are Jared Diamond, Francis Fukuyama, Yuval Harari, people who have written similar broad historical treatises that the public has read. So they're drawing you in with references you potentially would have read if you're going to be reading this. So you feel comfortable, but then they're almost immediately after that digging into the deeper pieces. But they're also looking, if you think of it as a bigger map of what are the adjacent possibles. Western culture has been so mired in this deathlock with a teleological end of where capitalism is going, and I think we're now seeing what unrestrained capitalism looks like. It's very rare that I hear anybody use the word mixed economy in the United States anymore, which is just painfully sad. But to draw a bigger map and figure out what the adjacent possibles look like, you have to be able to get down from your big mountain and go down into the valley and look up at the other mountains that are around you, or have a different perspective.
Yeah.
I almost spend most of the book doing that.
Yeah, I almost feel as if, because I did read when we were in that previous chapter, I did read the article that, that preceded that argument, right? And the article was much more focused, and it seemed to kind of stay on task and not sort of indulge itself in, in kind of speculation around the edges and stuff. And it strikes me that there's kind of another spectrum, right, from article to monograph to synthesis, right? And they've jumped over the middle step, right? And they've gone from article to synthesis, and and what they needed to do was write the kind of the more technical monograph. It wouldn't have probably been a New York Times bestseller. I think there are some. I think that buried under some of the fluff, there are the bones of that monograph in here. Some of the fluff is really kind of interesting. There's a moment there later on, and I think it's in chapter 10, they start talking about sort of this psychedelic Chavin tradition, perhaps, of peyote and other things. But there's actually kind of an echo of it, or a pre-echo, a premonition of it earlier on, right? There was somewhere along there. And on page 343, they're talking about streaming effigies emerge from clustered plant, human, and animal bodies, framed by figures with elaborate costumes, sometimes grasping hallucinogenic seeds and mushrooms. And among the crowd scenes, we find flower eaters with rainbows bursting from their heads. So are they saying that everybody's high in this moment on page on 343, or are they sort of leaving that out there? Are they leaving that on the table as a possibility? It seems like there are a lot of kind of those moments where, maybe they're alluding to more than they feel comfortable saying, and they're stuffing it all in there, which I agree, Mike, can be problematic, and it can be a distraction, and it can be off point, right? It can be.
What I would ask is to everyone here: is there a theory here? And if so, can you please state what it is?
Yeah. I think I can. I don't want to go first, though, if anybody else wants to.
I'll take a crack. I think primarily they're saying for most of the last 3,000 years of Western history, and certainly since 10,000 years ago at the beginning of agriculture, society, we have the perception that society is on a linear or maybe a logarithmic path to somewhere specific. And what they're saying is, if you look at the totality of other cultures in the archaeological record and what we know about other peoples who still are living in modernity, but are living in different cultures. That's patently not been the case for the last 250,000 years. So there isn't an end goal, but people have moved around and shifted and shuffled in terms of how they organize their societies and who they want to be. And with the idea being, what I think we're supposed to get out of it is, we have locked ourselves into this death grip with capitalism and ownership and property. And guess what? There is another way of living. And there are other models that we can look at for how to do that, to get from this hierarchy here with the 1% who own everything, to get the mass of the people over here. And I think those two things are the broader thesis of what's going on, or at least that's how I'm reading it.
So I appreciate that. But what I take from that, Chris, is this week's reading added nothing to the theory as far as you're concerned. It was just more anecdote.
I think, well, I would add to what Chris said that I think the other thing that they are not saying, that I think you want them to be saying, Mike, is that there actually is that there is going to be a new structure. There's going to be a new theory. There's going to be a new idea about society that nobody has had before. And I think one of the things that they say about Weber, if it might be somebody else, but I thought it was Weber, that was that they kind of go back to something that he said very early in his career, and they say, and then this was, and then he got famous and everybody forgot about this. I think one of the things that they are saying, I think one of their themes is not that, and I do think, and I will stipulate that we're coming up with a new science of history is regrettable. As a historian, I found that regrettable from day one. Okay, but having said that, I think not that new theories are, not that a new explanation is necessary to take over from this other single explanation, but that there are many explanatory tools that we can use in different circumstances, and that their mission in this book seems to be to break the idea that there is one trajectory, that it is teleological, or and probably logarithmic, like Chris said, and that we're at the end of it because we're so high on the S curve now, that there's no going back. And by complicating this, by saying that, look here, this didn't work the way they said it worked. Look here, this didn't work the way, and accumulating. I mean, basically, it's sort of like, you want to break the paradigm. You can't do it with just one anomaly, right? You have to pile on the anomalies until the camel's back breaks. And then you can start to argue about, what new theory or what combination of theories. I mean, oftentimes when the paradigm breaks, right? I mean, Newtonian dynamics doesn't go away, right? It just becomes a subset of a bigger theory. So that's my interpretation of what they thought they were doing in this.
I'm just, so it's really just, it's a pleasure for one thing just to be listening, but I was thinking that I think each of us reads books, and perhaps this book for different reasons. So it's curious to be asked the question, what is the theory? And maybe that question is also about the kinds of claims, as we've been describing, the claims they were making at the beginning of the book. But it's very interesting in chapter 10, for me, something, I mean, I'm not reading it from a position of expertise, anthropological expertise or historical expertise. So there's a sort of pleasure in the anecdotes, you might say, and in the stories, because they're by and large new to me. So that's one thing. But there's something I found in chapter 10, which I think it's partly about the sort of anti-teleological position or stance, which is to be wary of projecting ourselves onto history, and there's immense humility in that idea, even for all their you might say their excesses and the kinds of claims they're making. But that to be wary of that is, like, to me, is an extraordinarily powerful idea. I'm not sure I would call it a theory, but it's still something that it's it's grabbed my imagination.
And I think it's an intervention, right? In what had gone before. One of the things that jumped out at me in 10 was, again, these three principles of power that they put up against, to parallel the three principles of freedom, right? Sovereignty, administration, and charisma. And I hadn't thought of the Aztecs and the Inca and their imperial organization as being different from each other. And this gave me kind of this lens to do that, right? Because the Inca is very much more of an administrative state, right? And so actually the administration kind of persists after the Spaniards, Pizarro puts himself and his people on the throne instead of the sons of the dead Inca. But the other thing that jumped out at me too was this idea that going back to Diamond, right? Diamond's always talking about in collapse, right? He talks a lot about the failure of the Maya, right? And the failure of the Maya because they didn't have what we would recognize as kingdoms and empires when the Spaniards arrived, right? But another way of looking at that, and the way that they seem to be, when they say that, they had shifted to a decentralized society, and they say that there's every reason to believe that the spirit of rebellion, which has marked this particular region, the Yucatan, can be traced back to at least the time of Charlemagne, right? That this is, some type of indication of a choice. It's kind of interesting, and it's kind of ironic that the places that the Spaniards were able to conquer were empires, and the places that they had the most trouble with were places like the Yucatan, where they were already living kind of in a decentralized way. So I find that to be interesting, and I find that to be a more nuanced way of looking at the structures of societies, and the way that the ways that these people interacted. Oh, cool. Thanks, Simon. I jumped over the whole. I think the Kipu discussion in there is an interesting. For me, it was a tangent, but it was an interesting one.
So I think it was, I don't remember exactly when it was, maybe it was a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about how we thought that they really struck out on gender. So every time they talk about gender, I've been trying to pay a little bit more attention to it. And what I think is interesting is that they keep bringing it up. And then they also have that weird note about Crete or whatever. And I was like, is this where Wonder Woman came from? Like, what's going on here? But they just don't really seem to make a connection. They just say like, the segregation of, in like one paragraph, they say like, so the segregation of labor became really different, and it kind of sounds like it sucked for women, but then the whole society is more egalitarian. And I was like, wait, what? What do we mean by that? I didn't have time to go read the citation and like learn more about what that meant, but I was like, egalitarian for who? So a lot of my reading of this book has been like, they do the noble savage kind of thing. It's like, oh, would I want to like go have lived in this previous time? Like, would that have been better? And then I'm like, well, I don't think anyone like me would be happy in these previous times either. So I don't know what's going on there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Tim, you want to throw something in?
Yeah, listening to Mike and Simon, particularly, I sort of, having read what I've read, and I still haven't had the luck to go through elements of, we're quoting this guy, or we're using this piece of work, or we're looking at that other theory that much. And much the same as Chris said, the first couple of chapters, it was, everybody that's anybody that would have been interested has read Jacques Diamond and Tranter and etc. I don't see that much of this evening's discussion is actually talking about much of a difference. But that's coming from a very much of an engineering come science background, in the sense of we have a competing theory, and I go, nobody's come up even with a hypothesis. It's not like you've got pre-Copernican astrophysics versus Galilean astrophysics. And by the way, look through my telescope and you can see planet things that aren't mentioned in the Bible. So it must be right, because that must be wrong. And the solution to that is, oh, you want to come and look at some ironmongery that we've got that we heat up or sharpen up every now and then type. There's no dichotomy, seems to be. I mean, I want to give you a alternative theory of this is the method by which we rule people, and we're going to do it from this authoritarian point of view, this control of production, this control of information, versus the control of coercion. And I go, okay, that's crystalline honey and that's liquid honey. It's honey, right? There's not that sufficient division. Yes, you can put a cigarette paper down it if you want to get to the third derivative type, explain the word and check the spelling of the ands and the thers as well, seemingly. But I don't see it as that much of a big difference. So it's there's elements of as Chris was saying, there's lots of new to me type, or there's a level of detail that's new to me about how certain things were done in Mesoamerica and elsewhere, but it's not all of a sudden I've got three-legged people or two heads or people with wings. There isn't that big a difference. You know, I get fortunate. I mean, part of what I've said before is I've lived in Switzerland from the UK. I've lived literally, it was first 21 years of my life was in North London. I had never been away for more than 3 weeks in one solid go. And then I'm dropped into Geneva and I'm dropped into Frankfurt for 6 months. I'm dropped into the Middle East and I'm dropped into Singapore and Hong Kong for 6 months. And it's like, I get told by the friends I'm going out with, if you hear a guy say X, he's asking us, do you need a knife and fork because you're clearly a guaylo, you can't use chopsticks. And yet, oddly enough, partly because it's British and partly because it's North London, I suppose, I've been using chopsticks since the age of 5. You know, I've been using them almost as long as I've used a knife and fork, but not quite. And it's clearly not a problem, and I'm not asking for a knife and fork and a spoon, irrespective of what the Chinese or the Japanese or the Southeast Asian food has been asked for. So I don't see in that context that big a difference in terms of cultures at the time. So French agriculture philosophy versus elements of the Aztec or the Mexican floating island type culture, agriculture. What I do see is a big difference between, oh, let's do 30% soya beans, spray it to death, fertilize it to death, till it, versus things that are being seen as being sort of organic, alternative farming, come permaculture, come regen agriculture. I'm seeing a bigger difference there in some respects, but I'm not seeing this difference that is coming up at this time for such that Mike's saying there is no big thing. Yes, it could be in book 2, 3, 4, or 5, but we haven't got that yet, and I'll be surprised if we do get it, but simply because 50% of the production team isn't going to be working on it anymore. But it seems to be a very much a case not proven, and they need to do more, I think, of sufficiently different discovery to say that it could be different long term, and as it matured sufficiently by exposure to other people. The fact that they have been able to exist and they haven't seemingly substantially changed for 1,000 years because there's been no push from anywhere else. And then the Spaniards turn up with gunpowder and firearms and Black Death, and as well as the unfortunate bit of European diseases that does most of the work. They're clearly not sustainable in a resilient way, such that they've fallen over. So I don't see why I need to worry too much almost. As racist as that might sound in some respects, they've not had Mongol invasions 3 or 4 times over, which Europe had. It survived to a certain level. It's not had multiple invasions from Muslims, which Europe had and survived. And yet it's come out in terms of a renaissance and discovery of, in modern terms and modern times, of the world, a la Columbus and America, and even the British pirates going round, and Cook even. But it was resilient enough to beat everything else and win those individual competitions, however it did it. What is that telling us? None of that seems to come up.
Yeah, I think there's, well, there are a couple of things that I would kind of push back on a little bit, Tim. The differences in agriculture, I think, might be greater than you're appreciating between what the Aztecs are doing, and actually, the Aztecs may be, they may be more like, and again, in that whole argument about, sort of hierarchical people in Mesoamerica versus non-hierarchical people. The Aztecs were certainly way on the hierarchical side, but their agriculture was about 5 times more productive than anything that Europe or Asia had. I mean, the best thing going in Asia at the time was paddy rice, and Chinampa agriculture around Tenochtitlan in the lake was, 5 times as productive. Not to mention that they were also growing things like, spirulina algae, right? Which is still kind of a mystery to us. What were they doing with all of this? So the distance from what those cultures were doing and what Europeans were doing, and is, to me, is greater than the distance between traditional agriculture and industrial agribusiness. I think, I guess there is, industrial agribusiness is certainly a long way from sustainable and permaculture, but I don't think that it is I don't think that we should say that everything that came before, petroleum-based agribusiness is the same.
Well, that even Tim's comment too kind of brings up, and I'll tie it both back into the idea of the Kipu, and like Maggie, I kind of wish they had spent a little more time talking about gender differences, but I think we also don't have an archaeological basis to put more of that in there. But in a lot of these power structures, one group or multiple groups are fighting, and apologies for my camera dying again, but one group may fight against another. And when you've got a neighbor who's impinging on your space, and I think they talk about it a little more in, I think, chapter 11, the idea of a hierarchical society that is impinged upon by, barbarian invaders from the outside who kind of live off of those societies, and that moves back and forth. I think they even mentioned the old adage of the Mongols. You can conquer a society on horseback, but to govern it, you have to actually get off your horse, which, I tie into the Western idea of get off your high horse, which is a whole nother thing. But if you're the Spanish moving in and taking over, you don't have to fight the little people in the countryside. You have to fight the bigger power structure that's directing them. So they come in and they destroy the Kipu because that's the store of knowledge for the society and the culture and the power base. And by pulling that rug out from underneath them, the central authority no longer has the ability to command and rally around the smaller people in the countryside to fight against the invaders. But that same type of thing, I think, plays into, that the small snippets about women that, Maggie has mentioned. And one of the things that I think that's missing from the discussion, and I've seen it in 3 other places that I can tie back into this, particularly from the perspectives of orality and memory. If you think of the thousands of things in let's say a small hunter-gatherer society, there may be thousands of things in your environment that you potentially could eat. Some are poisonous and some are not. Some are better and more fecund and easier to gather in times of good. And others you would only eat during a famine, let's say. Mm-hmm. But that knowledge base and remembering all that takes a huge amount of overhead. And regardless of historically how it came to be that women were the gatherers and men were the hunters, in most of those smaller societies, there was a lot more equality because the day-to-day living and eating was contingent upon, let's say in a society where the women were the gatherers, the amount of knowledge you had to memorize and know about your immediate surroundings to be able to sustain the day-to-day food and life. And I think some sociologists and archaeologists have done work that 80% of the calorie intake of most societies was done by women in the gathering versus the 20%. And in those cases, the hunters were bringing back mostly protein, but all the daily calories were really brought in by women. So when you think about the amount of value that's coming in and the vast amount of knowledge it takes for whoever it is that's doing the gathering, women or otherwise, it's much harder to erase that work in smaller societies than it is to erase the work. It's very easy for the Spaniards to come in and collect and burn and destroy all the Kipu and totally marginalize all the amount of work that went into making them and keeping that up. But when you can erase that work, it becomes much harder to force those hierarchies into being. And then once they are, the people who benefit from them are only incentivized to keep them in place rather than to tear them down and bring us back to a more equal society. But it kills me that they're not, and maybe book 2 or 3 would have gone into some of these things. But I also think a lot of that, those ideas about orality and, memory systems as they evolve. In fact, I was kind of hoping they would pop up in chapter 11 when they were talking about the Cahokia, and, they totally, there was 15 opportunities for them to do that and they didn't. And I think in part it's because that piece of literature and research is so relatively new and fresh. It's going to be 50 years before that enters into the stream of consciousness of, broader anthropology.
I think there is a lot of evidence, though, that that women were, as you say, Chris, they were responsible for not only probably a bigger percentage of the calories that people were depending on, but also a more regular and probably in most cases a more storable version of foods, right? And so typically when somebody would bring, in a foraging society or hunter-gatherer society, when somebody would bring back a big, they talked about it, during the buffalo hunts and things like that, right? These were there was storage, right? There was smoking and creating jerky and things like that. But more often protein is more perishable, right? And so needs to be consumed. And that's where you get that sort of gift economy and politics around reciprocal exchange and things and gift giving.
Yeah.
Like that.
Well, that was one of the things I thought they missed with the Cahokia piece, is both it and there are probably 10 other societies that show that same pattern of people coming together in one mass place and building, monumental architecture, let's say. And it kind of fits in as well with their thesis of, we have one mode of living for, the spring and summer, and then we move to a different mode of living the other half of the year. Mm-hmm. But things like Cahokia typically would have been a central meeting place for not just one tribe, but multiple dozens or hundreds of tribes. And almost all of those locations are also tied in with cosmological and astrological underpinnings that relegate, if you're going to have a major meeting at a place like Cahokia for a month out of the year, you need a way for the people 1,000 miles away to know what time of year it is, which week we're going to show up there. Mm-hmm. But most of those also coincide with large production of kind of instantaneous food. So things like, and I think most people in North America, and particularly this last year, was, the cicadas in most of Illinois in the Midwest popped up on their regular cycle. Mm-hmm. And that becomes a massive amount of immediately eatable protein for thousands of people coming from, hundreds to thousands of miles away. So you don't need to hunt and gather to have a big meeting there, because you have an instantaneous food source that is going to pop up that will support several thousand people doing some work for weeks or a month, let's say. Now, maybe you supplement it with other things you gather in the outside, but then that makes an easy meeting place for a lot of people to do a lot of direct work, as well as trade and exchange. And they totally don't mention, or at least I haven't caught any mentions of those types of underlying structures of, if you're going to have several thousand people in either a temporary space or some space that shows up and exists for a few years, and they presume that maybe it's or they attribute it to an agricultural thing. Maybe people didn't feel as, they didn't have the 3 axes of freedom, so they moved away from that space and did other things. But I think there's other descriptions for why those patterns may have happened, we just are not, they're not widely known enough in the archaeology and the anthropology to, give us the additional underlying reasons why those things happen.
Mike.
Yeah, Dan, when we were just making small talk at the very beginning, I think you mentioned that you were, I can't remember, teaching a course or as part of a different course, kind of teaching how to do note making.
In historical methods. Yeah, this
Historical
week.
methods.
Yeah, this week where I was showing them different, I was showing them Zotero and Research Rabbit and Obsidian primarily.
Yeah. So one thing that in my long years of life, I only realized perhaps a couple of months ago, something so blindingly obvious. I guess most of you might be shocked that something so obvious only occurred to me right now. However, what does it mean to read a book for me? And it was only when I started working in this whole personal knowledge management or whatever the hell you want to call this stuff that I really started to think, I'll say less superficially, about what does it mean to be reading and to take notes. And I saw this video from this guy at MIT, Patrick Henry Winston, and it was about storytelling. And what he said, it's like, as soon as he said it, it was like, oh, of course, that's what it's got to be. So he was writing these artificial intelligence programs to extract stories like Macbeth. And he said, ultimately, there's all kinds of stuff happening in Macbeth. But to get the computer to extract the skeleton of it, you need to find different statements that are connected. And what does it mean to say they're connected? There's got to be either a causal relationship or some kind of argument relationship that is reason to conclusion. Now, I could read Dawn of Everything. And I mean, this is what I do when I read it. I take notes. But those initial notes are very, I guess you could call them fleeting if you wanted to coin a term, right? They don't really make sense to me until I've gotten some perspective on what is the book about. And then when I get that perspective, it's like this artificial intelligence program. What I really want to do is extract the skeleton. When you build a house, certain walls are weight-bearing and others are not. So the non-weight-bearing walls, you can put them up, you can take them down, but they have no real fundamental function other than aesthetic. So what I've been trying to do since I was enlightened, it was a personal discovery for me, but the rest of the world knew about this long before I figured it out, is say which parts of this book or article or podcast are necessary in order to develop the weight-bearing structure of this text, and which claims, which statements are fascinating, entertaining, upsetting. They might have all kinds of values, but I can discard them without losing the essential structure of the text. So that is what I have been trying to do with Dawn of Everything. And that is why I think chapter 10 was huge. And to be honest, I am also a little annoyed because generally when you write nonfiction, you try not to write it in the form of a mystery where, I gave you all the clues, but it's only in the the last chapter that I put everything together. Normally when you write nonfiction, you try not to bury the lead, but here we are, chapter 10. It's a long way through the book, and there's just all of these innovative new terms. So early on, we got the 3 freedoms: disobey, move away, and play with social structure. And now in chapter 10, we have 3 new terms: charisma, violence, and bureaucracy. So that is my goal. I agree totally with what Chris was saying before. The book does a great job arguing against teleology, and I agree. But I thought we had 9 chapters of that before we got to chapter 10. That wasn't a new point. But I do agree the book has done a really good job arguing against there being some end of history. So if I tear everything away and I ask myself, how can I describe the essential structure of this book to someone else? I'll start with a couple of things. One is, although there are all different kinds of social forms from the earliest prehistorical record, right? There is inequality, there is equality, there are all different kinds of social structures from the very beginning of what we're going to call the human species. We can agree that there was no state. Our initial state was stateless. And then, for reasons that are not necessarily clear to me, maybe others can enlighten me, but then there was, and not of necessity, but of fact, there was the institution of first order states and later second order states, and later the modern state. And of course, first order states have one of those forms of social power. Second order states have 2 kinds of social power. And the modern state sees all 3 forms of social power united. And of course, their argument is that there's no necessary connection among those 3 forms of social power. And they each had distinct and independent histories. But the factual matter is, there was an initial state. Do we call it the Garden of Eden? An initial stateless state. And then we went from that undifferentiated paradise to various degrees of domination. And now we are in a Weberian iron cage. We do not see any way out. That is the modern condition. We are in a place where we do not see any alternative to the modern state. Now, it's very clear to me that Graeber and Wengrow believe that that is false consciousness. There is the possibility of escaping from the iron cage. And one necessary condition for that escape is having a correct social theory, which they are attempting to provide. So one of the necessary conditions for leaving the iron cage is having a proper understanding of history and of the causal relations between some kind of base and social structure. It is clear to me that they believe that it would be better for us to return to a world where we could freely create and play with social structures. And it is clear that they believe right now, most people believe that's impossible. So I think that's the overall structure of the book. initial state was stateless. Ever since then, we have had the growth of forms of domination. Now, those forms of domination seem to be inescapable. However, if we have a proper social theory, we are presented not with a purpose, as Chris pointed out, right? Wengrow and Graeber are not telling us what the future should look like, other than it ought to be the intentional product of our conscious social deliberation, however we choose to create it. So I'll stop there, but that's to me, those are the weight-bearing claims of this book. And I don't think they have a satisfactory explanation of gender domination as opposed to other forms of domination. So all of that stuff, to me, those are the non-weight-bearing decorative walls.
Okay, what do you think they would do with, or what would you do with the idea that we are in the middle of a major shift in power from sovereignty to administrative bureaucracy in the form of multinational corporate power? See you later, Maggie. Oh, wait a minute. No, Tim, you're going. Okay, I see. All right. Take care, Tim.
I mean, they make some arguments about the WTO and the IMF, but I don't.
They just seem to wave at them in passing. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't see. I have to look at what are the terms they use, and what they say is, of the three freedoms, freedom to disobey is primary.
Mm-hmm.
And of the three dominations, violence is primary.
But is it? That's I think that they have been saying that historically it has been. The question I think that arises now is, in this new world of economic imperialism rather than political military imperialism, right? How does that really operate? Does it really require the operation of, is the assumption that globalist corporate power is based on and has its power in the fact that it has its fingers on the power of nations to administer force on their citizens and on the citizens of other nations? Or is there something else going on now that supervenes that?
Well, I those are all interesting questions. I guess first, I would ask, do they have a theory, and did I accurately represent it? I think I'm reading this book. I'll admit it. I think I'm reading this book way differently than most other people.
I guess my reaction
and the first thing I'm trying to do is not figure out, did they get the facts right?
Yeah.
Not that that's not an interesting question. It's a hugely interesting question. But my first question is, what the hell is the theory that they're putting forth?
Yeah.
So do they have a coherent theory?
Yeah,
and
see,
can I express it? And then later on, I'll try to criticize it.
I'm much less focused on that. I think there's much more value in narrative in this book than argument. But again, I think we all come looking for different things.
Let me reframe it the way you started out with how you're taking notes in reading this book. So you've read the book and you've taken notes on it, specifically with the target being, what are they saying and what are they talking about? And once you've done that, then you now have to peel back the additional layers of analysis. And to some extent, I'm reading it from a note-taking perspective, a whole different area. I'm reading it in a broader, they may be providing tidbits of information and knowledge that may be decorative and not on load-bearing walls, but those things may be more interesting to me for other theses I may be building or creating, or how can I take the broad ideas they're giving that are their load-bearing walls, and how do I rub those up against my ideas and weigh and balance them within my own notebook of other ideas and theories. So it's, yes, they have a structure, and I think to some extent you've kind of gleaned and gathered a broader thesis from them. But then the next part is, okay, within that idea, how does that idea weigh and balance against the million other ideas that are out there in that space? Which I think is, if there is progress and there's a teleological end, which we don't know about, the value of taking the idea they had and allowing it to have sex with all of the other ideas that are floating around it. Combinatorically, every one of us is going to come up with some different means of looking at it and weighing and balancing it, because we all have different contexts and different contents, either in our brains or in our notebooks, that we can do this with. But then once you've read the book and gleaned the 2 or 3 big ideas, or maybe you've taken totally other ideas out of this, I'm looking at it and reading it from a perspective of an anthropologist who's interested in orality and how that impinges, which is going to be a dramatically different reading maybe than Maggie or Nate or Plessy. But where do we go? And who is this? I have to say, who's Peter Kaminsky? I know who he is, but I see him pop up in the thing, and yet he has no presence within the vault, but I see notifications 4 times a day that he's there.
Really?
Yeah.
He just a lot of conflicting files. But I wanted to mention, I think basically what Mike and Chris, what you're talking about is the difference between analytical reading and syntopical reading. And so if anyone hasn't read How to Read a Book, it's a great book. You should read it. But basically, analytical reading is where you approach a text in order to learn from the author and increase your understanding. And also as part of that, you're kind of evaluating whether or not what this person is saying is full of shit or not, because you don't want to increase your understanding with something that's wrong or that you don't agree with. But then syntopical reading is about answering your own questions. So you're approaching it from your own unique point of view, right? I think I'm probably, and both are valid, and syntopical reading involves some element of analytical reading too, right? Yeah. So yeah. I think for me, I'm kind of doing a little bit of both. I am really thinking of this kind of book as a launching off point to exploring other ideas in more depth. Like this gender thing, I'm like, I feel like they're really not doing this justice. Like, where could I read more about that? So it is like a launching point, but I do also want to try to construct the structure, but it's making me feel a little bit better that it's kind of not super clear or obvious or like a little bit disappointing. But I'm kind of doing a little bit of both, I think.
Yeah. I used to feel like, my dad is a lit guy, right? He was an English teacher, and then he was a comp lit instructor at UC Davis. And so I kind of initially believed that you should try to be a blank slate, and you should try to get what the author is putting out there, right? And there should be this communication from author to reader and all of that. And then and I think probably that I do try that. I try to do that a little bit more with literature still. I don't really do it that much with nonfiction. I certainly don't do it that much with history. If I'm looking at a monograph, or if I'm looking at an article, I typically have I already have a point of view. I already have a perspective. I already have a set of questions. And so I think that I'm actually kind of doing myself a disservice if I don't sort of accept that and understand what it is that I'm going to the text for, as I'm doing it, because I've had that experience that you probably all had, coming back to something, 5 or 10 years later, and it's a whole different book, right? Because, you're not in the same place, you're not looking for the same things, you're not thinking the same thoughts as you're reading it. But I mean, for me, really, I'm not really feeling like I need them to make a case and prove it and sustain it and kind of satisfy me on these issues. I'm much more interested in the narrative, and I think that narrative is tricky, right? Because narrative often is seen as sort of the counterpoint to argument, right? But it isn't really. Oftentimes, narrative is argument, right? And because we don't recognize it as argument, it's often a sneaky way of arguing, right? So that whole thing fascinates me, and this thing that this performance that they're doing of kind of demonstrating these exceptions and this complication and this, and sort of all of this, that, I mean, if all they do is, kind of sustain that point that the way we used to look at this is too simple, then I'm satisfied. Plessy, do you want to throw something in? Okay. Nate, you've been kind of quiet.
I'm a little behind on the reading, so I saw the size of chapter 10, and I had my first week back teaching this week, and I was like, yeah, chapter 10's not going to happen this week.
Yeah, I think my butt too.
But now, since we've had this rich and interesting discussion about it, I'm much more motivated to recommit to that. I was just going to say that I use the short version of how to read a book, which is called How to Mark a Book. It's one of the first things that I give to all my classes. It's only 4 pages long, and I think it doesn't get into the nitty gritty of what's in the full text. But because I mainly teach freshman composition courses and study skills and things like that. And so for me, I love that, and it's I've gotten a lot of mileage out of it. My students seem to really appreciate it. But I think building off of what Mike was talking about, having, and kind of what you were talking about too, Dan, with your different approaches to different genres of books, having, for students to have an approach and then just to engage that metacognitive tool when they start to do a reading, okay, why am I reading this thing? I think that's a huge boon. Yep. That's funny that you find that, Chris, because that's actually where I oh, and Maggie found it too. That's actually where I went to undergrad.
Oh, wow.
Was UC Santa Cruz.
The banana slugs.
Yep, go banana slugs.
Cool. Yeah, I was not a huge. I mean, I had a little trouble assigning Adler, but I'll use that. That'll be cool. Thank you.
It's one of those things too. I don't think I see a lot of people in the knowledge workspace talking about Zettelkasten as if it's a brand new thing that just popped up yesterday. And everybody's, I think I've seen probably 20 different people write the statement that Luhmann invented it.
Yeah.
And if you haven't heard, he did not. The oldest version I found goes back to the 1500s with Conrad Gessner, who literally lays it all out. And literally the early street addresses of 16th century Vienna are exactly the same kind of numbering system that Luhmann uses, which I find hilarious. But we don't think about how those things work and what they're doing and why, but you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's time. It is time. So thanks everybody. There's a lot in the chat, so I will put it up in the vault, and I'll process this probably this evening since I got it now.
I haven't heard. How long are we going to go for, Dan? How many more?
I think we're gonna. I think we're planning. I was planning to do the last 2 chapters next week, unless people want to spend more time on chapter 10.
Okay. Or how long do we leave things open after that? I already see like a gradual slowing of what's happening in the vault.
Yeah. I was thinking I would move it over to publish, but then it wouldn't be open for people to continue adding stuff to, but it would still be visible.
Yeah.
But yeah, if you have some suggestions on that.
Or to, or to leave it for a week or 2 after, because I'm now crushed by other work and haven't been able to dump loads of notes in. And
oh yeah, I'm not going to rush to turn it off.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just a heads up, I will not be able to make the evenings of it tonight or next week either.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right, but see you a week from now then.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Good to see everybody.
Bye-bye.
Take care.